I've always loved hiking. There's something about the rhythm of my feet on the trail, the fresh air filling my lungs, and the feeling of nature enveloping me that makes everything else fade away. So, when my friend Sarah suggested a weekend camping trip to a remote hiking trail she'd read about, I jumped at the chance. We both needed a break from the chaos of our lives. We set out on a Friday afternoon, loaded with gear, excitement buzzing in the air. The trailhead was tucked away at the edge of the national forest, marked only by a small sign that seemed to blend into the surrounding trees. As we parked the car and slung our backpacks over our shoulders, I felt a thrill of anticipation. The woods were thick with tall pines, and the sunlight filtered through the branches, creating a dappled pattern on the ground. As we hiked, we talked about everything and nothing. Our plans, dreams, and the mundane aspects of life that felt lighter surrounded by nature. The trail was winding and rugged, a perfect escape from our daily routine. After a couple of hours, we reached a scenic overlook. The view was breathtaking. A vast expanse of forest stretching out before us, the colors shifting with the setting sun. After taking countless pictures, we decided it was time to set up camp. We found a small clearing not far from the overlook, ideal for our tent and fire pit. As we pitched the tent, the sky darkened, and a chill settled in the air. Sarah gathered firewood while I prepared dinner, the aroma of our meal mingling with the earthy scents of the forest. As darkness enveloped us, we lit the campfire, its warm glow providing comfort against the encroaching cold. We roasted marshmallows and shared ghost stories, laughing at our own nervousness. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake a strange feeling that hung in the air, a sensation that we weren't alone. When the fire dwindled to embers, we crawled into the tent, zipping it up tight against the night. The sounds of the forest were soothing, but that unease lingered. I told myself I was being silly. We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nature. It was supposed to be relaxing. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of rustling outside the tent. My heart raced as I listened, trying to decipher the noise. It was too rhythmic to be an animal, too deliberate. I gently nudged Sarah, who stirred but didn't fully wake. The rustling grew louder, and then I heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible but distinct. I strained to listen, my breath hitching in my throat. It was calling out, almost like a name, but I couldn't make it out. "Sarah," I whispered, shaking her again. She opened her eyes, squinting in the dim light. "What is it?" she murmured. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She listened for a moment, then shook her head. "Probably just the wind. Go back to sleep." But I couldn't. I felt paralyzed, caught in a web of anxiety. The whispering continued, weaving in and out of the rustling, and I could feel the cold sweat forming on my back. I waited, hoping it would stop, but it didn't. Instead, it grew louder, more insistent. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent and peered out, flashlight in hand, sweeping the beam across the clearing. The forest was still, but the air felt charged, as if it were holding its breath. The trees stood silent, shadows dancing in the weak light. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. No response, just the rustling sound, now creeping closer, like it was circling us. I quickly zipped the tent back up, panic setting in. I turned to Sarah, who was now wide awake, her eyes wide with concern. "We need to leave," I said, my voice barely steady. "What? Why?" she asked, confusion and fear crossing her face. "I don't know, but something's out there." I heard whispering, I replied, my heart racing. "Whispering?" she echoed, skeptical. "Let's just pack up," I urged, anxiety coursing through me. We hurriedly gathered our things, the sound of rustling growing louder outside. felt like something was just beyond the light, watching us. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the tent poles, the urgency of our situation crashing over me like a wave. Just as we managed to collapse the tent, the whispering turned into a cacophony of voices, overlapping, rising in intensity. It was no longer a single voice. It was a chorus of unintelligible sounds, urgent and pleading. I felt my blood run cold. "Run!" I shouted, and we bolted toward the trail. I had no idea what was behind us, but every instinct screamed at me to escape. We sprinted down the path, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly as I struggled to see. The voices followed us, echoing through the trees, their tone shifting from pleading to angry. My lungs burned as I pushed myself harder, adrenaline fueling my fear. The trail twisted and turned, and I struggled to remember the way we'd come. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I focused on the beam of light ahead, guiding us forward. "Do you see the trailhead?" Sarah shouted, her voice strained with fear. "Not yet," I replied, my heart racing. The darkness felt suffocating, as if it were closing in around us. We stumbled through the underbrush, the voices growing more frantic. They seemed to be urging us to stop, to listen, but I couldn't. Finally, I spotted a faint glow in the distance, our car's headlights. Hope surged through me, and I pushed myself harder. "There it is. We're almost there," I yelled, my voice filled with urgency. As we neared the clearing, I glanced over my shoulder. The shadows seemed to shift, a dark shape lurking just beyond the trees. I couldn't make out what it was, but the presence felt all too real, a weight pressing down on me. We burst into the clearing, and I rushed to the car, fumbling for my keys. My hands shook as I unlocked the door, and we both dove inside, slamming the doors shut. I quickly turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life. The forest stood silent around us, the whispers fading into the night, but the air felt thick with tension. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chasing us, but there was nothing, just the shadows of the trees, standing still and quiet. "Drive," Sarah urged, her voice a mix of fear and adrenaline. I slammed the car into gear and sped out of the parking lot, tires screeching against the gravel. We didn't speak for a long time, the only sound the hum of the engine and the rush of wind as we left the forest behind. As we drove, the tension slowly faded, but the fear lingered in the back of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us, waiting in the shadows. The voices, the whispers, they felt real, a reminder of the darkness that could lurk just beyond the light. When we finally reached the main road, I let out a shaky breath, feeling the weight of the forest lift off my shoulders. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. What had we encountered out there? What had been calling to us in the dark? In the days that followed, I tried to forget about the experience, but the memory haunted me. I searched online for any news about the trail, hoping to find some explanation for what had happened. That's when I stumbled upon a local forum discussing disappearances near that area. Hikers who had gone missing, strange noises reported in the woods, tales of voices calling out to lost souls. I felt a chill run down my spine. Had we stumbled into something we weren't meant to find? Something that claimed the woods as its own? Sarah and I talked about it, trying to make sense of what had happened. We both agreed to stay away from that trail, to never return to that part of the forest. But the fear lingered, a shadow that followed me into my dreams. Even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling of those voices echoing in my mind, the whispers that called out to us in the night. I've returned to hiking since, but I stick to well-traveled paths, always aware of the darkness that can lurk just beyond the light. Nature is beautiful, but it can also be treacherous, and some trails are better left unexplored. I've always been the type who enjoys driving at night. There's something calming about the empty roads, the hum of the engine, and the cool air seeping through the cracked window. The world feels quieter, more manageable when the sky is dark, and everyone else is asleep. You can lose yourself in the miles, the lines on the road hypnotizing you into a peaceful rhythm. But one night, a drive I had taken countless times before turned into something I wish I could forget. Something that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. It was late, maybe 1 or 2 a.m., and I was driving down a long stretch of highway on my way back from a friend's house. The route was familiar, just miles of open road cutting through stretches of farmland and thick woods. I'd driven this road so many times I could probably do it with my eyes closed. The darkness was deep, with only the occasional flicker of headlights from a distant truck. For long stretches, I was completely alone. The night was clear. Stars dotted the sky, and the moon cast a faint glow over the landscape. Everything seemed calm, peaceful even. I had the radio on low, just background noise to keep my mind from wandering too far. As I drove, I noticed the road seemed even more deserted than usual. No cars ahead of me, no headlights in my rearview mirror, just the endless stretch of black asphalt and the faint, distant hum of crickets in the fields. It must have been around mile marker 147 when I first noticed something strange. The air changed, felt heavier somehow, thicker. It wasn't a storm, the sky was still clear, but there was this weight, like the atmosphere had shifted. I shrugged it off at first, thinking maybe I was just tired, the fatigue of a long day playing tricks on me. I took a sip of water and kept driving. That's when I saw it. Up ahead, on the side of the road, was a car. It was an older model, maybe from the 90s, with its hazard lights blinking. The car was parked just past a bend in the road, angled awkwardly on the shoulder. As I got closer, I could make out more details. The front end was crumpled, as if it had been in a minor accident, but there was no sign of another vehicle or any skid marks. Just the single car, hazard lights flashing in the darkness. I slowed down instinctively, looking to see if someone needed help. I didn't see anyone standing by the car, though, and no one was waving me down. It felt wrong. Something about the scene made my stomach twist in a way I couldn't explain. I told myself that maybe the driver had already called for help and was waiting somewhere nearby. Still, as I passed by, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A few miles down the road, I saw another car. This one was newer, a sleek black sedan, also pulled over on the shoulder with its hazard lights blinking. The front of the car looked fine, no visible damage, but there was no one around. No driver, no passengers. Just the car sitting there in the dark, lights flashing rhythmically in the night. My heart started to beat a little faster. What were the chances of two cars being pulled over so close to each other, both with no sign of anyone nearby? I kept driving, my fingers tightening on the steering wheel. The feeling of heaviness in the air hadn't gone away. If anything, it was getting worse. The road seemed darker now, the trees on either side looming like silent sentinels. I flicked off the radio, suddenly finding the music too loud, too jarring. The only sound was the steady thrum of the tires on the road and the occasional crunch of gravel when my wheels drifted slightly off the pavement. That's when I saw the third car. It was a blue pickup truck, older, maybe from the 80s. It too was pulled over on the side of the road, hazards flashing in the dark. Unlike the others, this one had clear signs of a crash. The front was smashed in, and one of the headlights was shattered, casting an uneven beam across the road. I slowed down, almost stopping this time, my mind racing. What the hell was going on? 3 cars, all abandoned, all within a few miles of each other. I glanced around, half expecting someone to step out of the woods or wave me down. But there was nothing. Just the empty road, the flickering lights, and the oppressive silence. My heart was pounding now, and every instinct was screaming at me to keep going. Whatever was happening here, I wanted no part of it. I pressed down on the gas and sped up, trying to put as much distance between myself and those abandoned cars as possible. Then, about 5 minutes later, I saw movement in the distance. At first, I thought it was an animal crossing the road, maybe a deer or a coyote, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't an animal. It was a person. A man was walking slowly down the center of the road. His back was to me, his gait slow and deliberate, as if he were out for a casual stroll. But there was nothing casual about this situation. I slowed down, unsure of what to do. My headlights illuminated him fully now, a tall figure wearing a dark coat that seemed out of place on such a warm night. His hair was long and disheveled, and he moved with a strange, jerky motion, like each step took more effort than it should. I honked my horn, just a quick beep to get his attention, to let him know a car was coming. He didn't react. He didn't turn around. He just kept walking straight ahead, as if I didn't exist. My stomach twisted in knots, and every instinct told me to get out of there. But I couldn't just run him over. I slowed down to a crawl, trying to edge my way around him. As I pulled alongside him, I risked a glance out the passenger window, my pulse hammering in my ears. He turned his head slowly to look at me. I wish he hadn't. His face was wrong, pale, gaunt, with sunken eyes that seemed to bore into me. His lips were cracked and pulled back into a twisted, unnatural smile. But what unnerved me the most were his eyes. They were too wide, too bright. They reflected the light from my headlights in a way that they shouldn't. It was as if he could see right through me, into every dark corner of my mind. And he knew something I didn't. I slammed on the gas. The car lurched forward, and I sped away, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't look back. Couldn't. My hands were shaking, and the heaviness in the air felt like it was pressing down on me, suffocating me. I didn't slow down until I saw the lights of a gas station up ahead, the first sign of life I'd seen in miles. I pulled into the parking lot, my hands still trembling on the wheel. The fluorescent lights flickered above me as I sat there, trying to catch my breath. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that man standing in the road behind me. But there was nothing, just the empty highway stretching out into the night. I got out of the car and went inside the gas station, the bell above the door jingling as I entered. The clerk behind the counter looked up at me, bored, barely registering my presence. "You all right, man?" he asked, his voice flat. I nodded, though I didn't feel all right at all. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I grabbed a bottle of water from the cooler and approached the counter, trying to calm my nerves. "You seen anyone on the road tonight?" I asked, my voice shaky. The clerk raised an eyebrow, clearly uninterested. "What do you mean? Like a guy walking? Or any cars pulled over?" I trailed off, unsure how to explain it without sounding insane. The clerk shook his head. "Nah, it's been dead out there all night. Haven't seen a car come through in hours." I felt a chill run down my spine. How could that be possible? I thought. I passed 3 cars, all with their hazards on. And that man, he had been right there. I'd seen him. "You sure?" I pressed. A few miles back, there were a couple of cars on the side of the road. The clerk shrugged. "I mean, I've been here since midnight. No one's come in. No one's been out there." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. There was no way I'd imagined it. The cars had been real. The man had been real. Hadn't they? I paid for the water and left the gas station, my mind spinning. When I got back in the car, I sat there for a few minutes, trying to make sense of it all. The road stretched out in front of me, dark and empty, as if nothing had ever happened. I didn't want to keep driving, but I didn't have much of a choice. The thought of turning back was out of the question. There was no way I was going back down that road. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtering to life, and pulled out of the gas station. The drive back home was quiet, uneventful. The heaviness in the air lifted as I got further away, and by the time I reached my house, it almost felt like a bad dream. Almost. I didn't tell anyone about what happened that night. How could I? They'd think I was crazy. Hell, sometimes I think I'm crazy. But I know what I saw. I know that something was out there on that road. Something that wasn't right. I haven't driven that stretch of highway since. I take the longer route now, even though it adds an extra hour to my drive. It's worth it to avoid that place. To avoid whatever was out there that night. But sometimes, late at night, when the roads are empty, I think about that man's face. About those wide, unnatural eyes staring back at me. And I wonder if he's still out there, walking down that empty road, waiting for someone else to come along. I've always been an adventurer at heart, drawn to the wild and untamed corners of nature, the thrill of the unknown, the beauty of untouched landscapes. These are what keep me going. So, when I heard about a new trail that had recently opened up in the national park near my home, I couldn't resist. It was supposed to lead to a breathtaking overlook, a view of the valley that was rumored to be one of the best in the state. I decided to take a solo camping trip to explore it. The day started off beautifully. The sun was shining, and the air was crisp with the promise of autumn. I loaded my backpack with essentials. A tent, sleeping bag, food, and plenty of water. After a quick breakfast, I set off early in the morning, excited to hit the trail. As I began my hike, I felt a rush of exhilaration. The trail was well marked, winding through dense forests and vibrant patches of wildflowers. I passed several other hikers along the way, each of us exchanging friendly smiles and nods. But as I ventured further in, the crowd began to thin out, and soon, I was alone on the path. That's when I noticed how quiet it had become. The rustling leaves, chirping birds, and the distant sound of a flowing stream faded into an unnerving stillness. I paused for a moment, taking a deep breath, trying to shake off the sudden chill that crept over me. I attributed it to being out of my comfort zone. After all, I was deep in the woods, far from civilization. The trail continued to twist and turn, and I followed it eagerly. Hours passed, and just as I was starting to feel the weight of fatigue in my legs, I reached a clearing. Before me lay the overlook, a stunning view of the valley below, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. I stood there, awestruck, taking in the breathtaking sight. It was worth every step I had taken. After soaking in the view, I decided to set up camp nearby, just a short distance from the edge of the overlook. I wanted to be able to watch the sunrise in the morning, knowing it would be spectacular from this vantage point. The ground was a bit rocky, but I managed to find a relatively flat spot to pitch my tent. I gathered firewood and prepared a simple meal, feeling content as the sun dipped below the horizon. As night fell, I sat by the fire, feeling the warmth on my skin. The sky above was a canvas of stars, twinkling brightly in the clear night air. I roasted marshmallows, letting the sugary goodness melt in my mouth, savoring the sweetness. But as I looked up at the stars, the eerie stillness returned. The only sound was the crackling of the fire, and it felt like the forest had become a silent spectator. I shrugged off the feeling, attributing it to my imagination. It was late and I was tired. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up securely, and fell asleep almost immediately. I was jolted awake in the middle of the night by a sound. At first, it was faint, a rustling noise outside my tent. I held my breath, listening intently. It was definitely something moving through the underbrush, not far from where I was sleeping. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to hear more clearly. The rustling stopped, and for a moment I thought maybe it was just an animal, a deer or a raccoon. But then I heard it. A low, guttural growl, not far from my tent. Panic surged through me. My mind raced with thoughts of bears or mountain lions. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. I pointed it at the tent's fabric, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. My heart pounded as I listened, half expecting to see a wild animal at any moment. But there was nothing. The sound of my breathing filled the small space of the tent, and the darkness felt suffocating. I tried to convince myself that it was just a figment of my imagination, but the growl echoed in my mind, relentless and real. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart, and slowly unzipped the tent, pushing it open just a crack. Peering out, I scanned the area around me. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint glow, but the surrounding woods were cloaked in shadows. I saw nothing, just trees standing silently, watching. I slipped back into the tent, feeling the cold air seep in. My instinct screamed at me to pack up and leave, but it was the middle of the night, and the thought of hiking down the trail in the dark was terrifying. I convinced myself that I was being paranoid. After all, it was probably just a raccoon rummaging through the leaves. I tried to sleep again, but it eluded me. I tossed and turned, every sound outside amplifying my fear. Hours passed, and just as I started to drift off, I heard it again. A distinct rustling, this time closer than before. I sat up, heart pounding, flashlight gripped tightly in my hand. The growl returned, deeper and more menacing. It was right outside my tent. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I flicked on the flashlight, pointing it toward the noise. The beam cut through the darkness, and in that moment, I saw it. A pair of glowing eyes reflected the light, staring right back at me from the shadows. They were far too low to the ground for a bear, but too large for any small animal I could think of. I froze, caught in a moment of terror. The creature shifted, and I saw its silhouette. A low, hunched shape, its outline blending into the darkness of the trees. It let out another growl, a sound that made my skin crawl. Without thinking, I scrambled backward, pressing myself against the tent wall. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The eyes remained fixed on me, unblinking, almost hypnotic. My mind raced through every possible option, but all I could think of was getting out of there. I reached for my backpack, fumbling for anything that could serve as a weapon. I found my multi-tool and held it tightly, the cold metal a small comfort. The growl escalated, a low rumble that resonated in my chest, and the creature took a step forward, pushing against the tent. Panic surged. I knew I had to act. With a surge of adrenaline, I unzipped the tent and bolted out into the night, the cold air hitting me like a slap. I didn't look back, my only focus on getting as far away as possible. I ran blindly through the dark, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly, illuminating nothing but trees and underbrush. I stumbled and fell, the rough ground scraping my hands and knees, but I pushed myself up and continued to run. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to put distance between myself and whatever that thing was. The forest seemed alive, branches clawing at me as I ran, roots tangling around my feet. My heart raced, my breath coming in quick gasps. I had no idea how long I had been running when I finally caught a glimpse of something. A light through the trees. Hope surged within me. I sprinted toward it, praying it wasn't just another trick of the darkness. As I broke through the last line of trees, I found myself at the edge of a clearing. There, in the distance, was the parking lot where I had left my car. I dashed toward it, adrenaline propelling me forward. I could hear the rustling behind me, the growl echoing in the still night air. I reached my car, fumbled with my keys, and finally managed to unlock the door. I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. As I sat there, panting, I could hear the sounds of the forest around me, normal now, as if the creature had vanished into the shadows. I took a moment to collect myself, my heart still racing. But as I glanced back toward the trail, I swore I saw those same glowing eyes staring at me from the tree line, watching, waiting. Without another thought, I started the car and sped away, not daring to look back. The forest blurred past me, the memories of that night forever etched in my mind. I never went back to that trail, and I never camped alone again. For weeks after, I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the sound of that growl echoing in my ears. I avoided the woods, finding solace in the familiarity of my home. But even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that something is still out there, waiting, watching, lurking in the darkness. I've heard stories since then about other hikers who vanished near that area. Whispers of creatures that are said to roam the woods. I used to dismiss those tales, but now I wonder if they were warnings all along. There's a darkness in the forest that can't be ignored. And I learned it the hard way. Nature is beautiful and wild, but it also holds secrets, some that are best left undisturbed. For me, the wilderness will forever be a reminder of the night I faced what was lurking in the shadows.